We're watching the defense give their closing arguments there in the Lindsay Clancy murder trial. She's the woman who's on trial for the death of her children. And Peter, it sounds like the jury's decision got a little more complicated even before these arguments started.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This case got very complicated yesterday when the judge decided that this jury can consider the lesser included offenses of second-degree murder and manslaughter. This is no longer a question of, is Clancy unable to tell the difference between right and wrong because of her psychosis and get sent to a facility, or get sent to prison because she's guilty of first-degree murder. The jury has more options now. So basically, according to this instruction, which the jury just heard before we got into closing arguments, they first have to consider this question about whether or not Clancy was able to tell the difference between right and wrong. If they conclude that she was suffering from a mental defect that prevents her from being able to make that distinction, conform her actions to the law, then she'd be found guilty not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility, commonly known as the insanity defense. If it's the case that they believe she was not suffering from that kind of mental defect, they then get to the next question of, should this be first-degree murder, should this be second-degree murder, or should this be manslaughter? And I think that distinction really depends on what they determine happened in the moments when she killed those children. How much intentionality was there? How much cruelty was there? How much deliberate action was there? How much of her actions was influenced by the fact that she was on all these prescription medications prescribed by her doctors? So we'll see how this impacts deliberations, of course. We're still in the middle of closing arguments, but it certainly gives the jury more options to think about.
Shana, does having those options on the table change the strategy for either side in closing arguments?
Absolutely. This is really going to force everyone, and that's the first question, is whether or not they believe that she was able to appreciate her decisions. And so the defense is really going to focus in and hone in on what their witnesses said, what the psychologists that they put on, because they don't even want the jury to attempt to go down the other road to determine if she had criminal responsibility. Because now that you've opened up the lesser included, it means that she didn't need the intent. That was the very high bar. Without that, they could find that she's guilty of one of the lesser included, murder, manslaughter. So you're going to see the defense really hone in on this sort of idea that she had the mental defect. You're also going to see the state hone in on that because they want the jury to get past that hurdle. They want to say, no, there were enough actions and inconsistencies that you could find that she was not suffering from a mental defect, because they want the jury to be able to get to those other lesser included.
Peter, what's the potential sentence if Clancy is convicted of manslaughter?
Yeah, so it's up to 20 years in prison if she's convicted of manslaughter, and that's pretty significant compared to the first-degree or second-degree murder charges. In that case, if it's first-degree murder that she's found guilty of, that's a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole. If she's found guilty of second-degree murder, that's a mandatory life sentence as well, though it comes with the possibility of parole. And of course, if she's found not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility, then she'll get sent to a state psychiatric facility. The judge actually instructed the jury what would happen in that case. She'd be basically sent to one of these state-run facilities, and if ultimately it's determined that she's no longer suffering from her mental illness and that she no longer poses a threat to the community, she could eventually get released.
Shana, what else are you listening for in closing arguments?
What I'm looking for is each side to really tie their arguments to the witnesses and to the actions. They're going to want to create a roadmap for the jury as to essentially what their argument is, and then back that up by testimony. That's really important because you want to be sure that you are tying whatever it is that you're saying to the jury, what you intended to prove, how you proved it, and what witnesses you proved it through. That's very important because that's all the information that the jury is going to take back in there, and they're going to remember these closing arguments, because after 21 days worth of testimony, some of it does get lost, and the jury is going to reflect back to these closing statements very closely.
Peter Haralambous, Shana Lloyd, thank you both.